Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam.
Hello, hello.
And we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts.
And today we are debating what should Uji Matcha be. So for
Yep.
those of you that haven't listened to our previous content, we have released a piece on what is and was Uji Matcha, which was an editorial conversation on a 5-part Substack post that we did called Uji no Matcha, the inconvenient truth behind Japan's most mythologized tea label. So this is the end of the series of the deep dive that we have done on Uji Matcha. Well, I don't know, Sam, do you take a side one way or the other for debating like what should Uji Matcha be, or are you where do
Yeah,
you lean?
it's difficult. So before we start this podcast, Ryan and I were talking about the setup being like we flip a coin, and then each of us will literally pick a side and then debate over each other. But after some thoughts, I think it's much easier if we just talk over, each other's point. Because at least for me, I can see like merits on both sides and also a lot of shortcomings too. So it's kind of complicated to unwrap.
Yeah. Before we dive into it, just to give everyone a brief summary of what's been said. First of all, just an acknowledgement. A lot of content is going to be repeated in this episode. We'd like to think that our ideas get more refined, more articulate, and that we're able to synthesize these arguments better after we have made them X number of times. So, heads up, there's not a whole lot of new information other than new and what we hope to be fresh framing of these issues. But the
Mm,
broader context is that Uji Matcha, the provenance of tea labeled as Uji Matcha is really diverse. Some of it actually comes from Uji, some of it comes from towns that are nearby Uji, but some people are willing to die on the hill that it's also Uji or the Uji region. You have the trademark definition, which was established in 2004. And then you have sort of this expansive blend rule where you can take anything from the trademark definition zone. And so long as it's at least 50% of the material, you can blend in other tea and still call it an Uji matcha blend. So that's a lot of
yeah.
definitions that don't agree with each other.
And you have the outro Uji definition, which are frequently made by Uji tea farmers that are literally in Uji, arguing that, it should really be Uji grown tencha.
That's right. And
So,
then you can add a temporal layer on top of this and say, okay, this is the variety of the provenance that we see being labeled as Uji matcha today, which legally, to the best of my knowledge, there's no reason why you couldn't import tencha from mainland China and have it be one of the components of a quote Uji matcha blend. So the provenance could be a blend even coming from multiple countries today. That was almost certainly not the case 30 years ago. And then the further you wind back the clock, the definition of the provenance of the tea that was being labeled as Uji matcha has changed. So then you can go back and layer on various levels of historical argument about what Uji matcha was. And when you go backwards, then you can kind of project forward too. What should it be? Which is, the conversation that we want to have now.
that's right. So, if we really rewind the clock back to, the definition of modern matcha, which is, has to be milled from tencha, and tencha has to be cultivated under a shading condition. The Uji farmers had the most legit point. This type of tea that's very well defined can only be legally produced in Uji back in the days that are supervised by all these chashis, which were serving the shogunate at the time. So, do you think we should pick their side, Ryan?
Well, yeah, you're right. Historically, for hundreds of years, matcha and its current definition, which I guess we should define before we start talking, needing to be from shade-grown tencha, which is steamed, destemmed, and deveined green tea
Mm.
that's been shaded, only came from one town in Uji. But shaded cultivation was literally prevented anywhere else. And for hundreds of years, not only all the Uji matcha in the world, all of the matcha in the world came from one town that was basically its own form of had its own form of government protection, government state-controlled monopoly, state development. And then that's all slowly started to unwrap as the state literally changed as we moved into the Meiji period. And then things started to loosen up. And then it's gone through various waves of consumer bases too. The consumer base for matcha has changed meaningfully 3 times. One being the elites of the Edo era,
Mm.
then a huge change when the schools, particularly Urasenke and Namoto Senke, gained a lot of ground, especially through the government campaign Good Wives and Wise Mothers, where it was taken up as part of bridal training and girls' schools education and etiquette. And then you could argue there's a quote unquote third wave of matcha consumers being sort of the global global consumption base we see today, where, you can be in Paris, Dubai, New York, Santiago, Chile, and, have a great matcha latte. So
Mm.
it's, it,
Very top-down movement, if you think about it.
the last movement is like much more grassroots, where you have a bunch
Yeah,
of
yeah.
you don't have all this context, or not necessarily all the history or the culture of it that are taking it up, which it's the world we live in now. But the way this Uji-cha name has evolved through these levels of practitioner bases too, it's worth considering. And Sam, this
Mm,
brings me back to exactly the podcast episode that we adore so much. What do you care about? It's so
mm.
perfectly onto here.
Or who do you identify you are? Because like if you pick
Yeah.
team Uji farmer, and you literally will not be able to drink matcha or Uji matcha ever again. That will go back to the shogunate period, and those tea will certainly be reserved by a very 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 small group of people, and this will forever be a myth to the majority of the population. The fact that you are be able to drink uji matcha or actual uji matcha for that matter, like you can still go to uji and buy Hori and a bunch of other producers in a fairly reasonable price. It's because we are having the current systems being set up in Japan. So like it's like what do you care about actually? Like if you do end up picking a side and have the ability to change the reality, then you are literally, cutting yourself out from some delicious tea.
Yeah, that's true. It was so
Mm.
exclusive for so long.
Yeah.
Shanayu and Shanayu narrative infuse modern marketing brands all over the place. People talk about Ichigo Ichie or One Moment, One Time. People talk about Zen. People talk about meditation. People talk about the beauty of simplicity and rusticity and sort of this dignified poverty look of wabi sabi. And these intentions are all great, but there's a huge reality is that during the formative years, the invention of essentially uji matcha, during this period of state controlled monopoly, it was not for the everyman or the everywoman. It was a highly exclusive tea. It was extremely expensive. And despite what these traditions say about inclusivity and, everyone has to bow before going in the tea room's little door to show that everyone is equal in this tea room. And, there's all sorts of these little stories in Chanoyu about, peasants being invited or fishermen's being invited to come to tea ceremonies. The reality on the ground is that it was probably a very elitist and sexist institution or institutions or cultural practice is another way to put it. So if you
Mm.
purely care about accessibility and equality, you're right. We have never been in a better time for matcha. Like, let's take what is the most uji matcha we can think of? For me, it's probably from Horishi Shimean, Okunoyama Tea Garden. Let's say the Okunoyama cultivar, which we know comes from Uji native zairai, from a 400-year-old plant, and where they have cuttings of this cultivar still grown in one of the oldest known plots in that date back to Uji Shishimean, the state controlled monopoly. As part of one of the 7 famous tea gardens of Uji. You can buy that tea at Hori Shishimeya. I think it's 35 or $40, and I'm pretty sure you can buy it online. And anyone in the world, if you take into account shipping, can access this tea for, let's say, between $50 to $100 to their door, whether or not you
Mm.
live in Norway or South Africa or like anywhere. That is crazy, right? This accessibility, if you exist in order to have consumed a product like this hundreds of years ago, you would have literally had to win the genetic lottery, or what Warren Buffett would call the divine right of the womb. You would have had to have been born in the right family, in the right circumstances, with enough money and good fortune. I probably had to prepay for your tea to get it as then tencha, and then you would have one of your servants mill it into matcha for you, where you had your tea ceremony, where you pretended to live in this dignified poverty. It's just not the realities of what this was. And just from an accessibility point of view, what Uji Matcha has turned into now is a beautiful thing. And the fact that it's even accessible. But Sam, I feel like
Yeah,
we're steering
totally.
off course a little bit. So, like, if we were to debate, let's take the most conservative definition, where uji matcha needs to come from uji grown tencha, and the least conservative definition, which is uji matcha is a processing culture and a culture of processing tencha and blending it into a product, and that theoretically it can be made from other material, and a slightly more conservative definition might be the Yamashiro region, or the towns that were more geographically close to Uji and that had
Mm.
supplied Uji blend houses for, let's say, around 100 years, because no one was growing tencha there until around the 20th century. But they were supplying sencha and other teas that were purchased and blended by Uji Matcha. So there is at least a culture of exchange going on within this Yamashiro region, which includes counties like Joyo, like Wazuka, like Kyoto-nabe, among others. And then the most expansive definition, which I feel like you and I tend to lean towards sometimes when we talk through arguments in this podcast, that it's really just a processing culture. And that because matcha is not very terroir driven, which we can get into in a bit, it can theoretically be grown anywhere. And that all matcha after, the fall of Edo, the fall of the shogun, is kind of uji matcha, at least in spirit, because that's where that whole culture was originally invented anyway. So even these, companies setting up in
Yeah,
China or
and
Korea are in some ways legacies of this quote uji matcha tradition, and have some claim the same way that these Yamashiro towns do, or the prefectures bordering Kyoto Prefecture, like Mie or Shiga, etc.
yeah, or they can be somehow linked back to Uji or tea companies in Uji, right? It's either through education or training or commission or all these market procurement contracts and all that, and it's literally a organic expansion of Uji that's that's being called Uji matcha at large. But it's really a Uji system, a Uji culture that we are seeing. But yeah, there are a lot of sides that and a lot of different definitions we can explore. But I feel like that if you really care about these definitions and the truth of these claims behind anyone that made such a statement on either of these definitions, the only really traceable and verifiable definition will be the Uji tea farmers that you trust, obviously, because they are physically there. You can physically see all those teas. And all of the other definitions lacks a regulatory entity or very verifiable truth. Like, they tell you how much portion of their tea or blends. Very infrequently they will tell you, but if they do, are coming from, some certain regions, in Kyoto prefecture. But how do you actually know? There's no way you can really verify those information.
If you look at like product positioning, people don't tell you what they believe the uji matcha definition that they're using is, right?
Mm.
Some people, it's from uji grown tencha, and sometimes they tell you that. For other people, they say it's single origin, and you can tell that whoever is selling and marketing and positioning the product really has no clue about how complicated the network of provenance is for the uji matcha label, right? Like, honestly, our first trip into Japan, we were handed tons of price lists. And like, you go to producers in Yame, you go to producers in like Izumo, you go to producers in in Nara, for example, and you ask for a price list. And somewhere on that price list is probably the terms Uji matcha, or even in Nishio, right? Everyone is selling this Uji matcha. And all of the other tea on this price list, Yame Yame, Kagoshima Kagoshima, Nara Nara Nara, probably comes from that place. And then you have this thing, right? It'd be so weird to go back and say, is this really from Uji grown tencha? No one does that. No one thinks to ask that question. Right? Most
Mm.
people go in with ears wide open, ready to believe whatever people tell them because they're a Japanese tea farmer. But the reality check that most people never get is typically what you hear is opinion and very strong perspective. And those people trying to sell that Uji matcha are in the business of selling tea, right? And it was so weird when I was putting together this price list of tencha for people who are part of our beta program that have purchased a mill. I kept finding myself writing the sentence. This was labeled as Uji matcha, but it's actually from Fukuchiyama. You can technically label it and call it as Uji matcha. And it would probably give you a marketing advantage because most consumers are only looking for Uji matcha. And this is the rules of the game that everyone else is playing. And,
Yeah,
you know,
this is
now
exactly why this definition has expanded so much because you can sell it better. It's all comes down to the business.
it's like that one Chinese comedian who's in the States, who's not very religious, and a bunch of missionaries came up to him and says, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" And he says, "No." And he says, "But if you don't believe in him, you'll go to hell." And he says, "Well, what about the people that live on an uninhabited island that have never heard of Jesus?" And the missionary says, "Well, they've never heard of him. They never had the opportunity, and God will forgive them." And they can go to heaven. And he said, then why did you tell me?
Why did you
And, whether or not you're Christian or whatever your religion is, now with this Uji matcha thing, if you know the truth, I can say, oh, this is labeled and sold as Uji matcha. This material actually comes from Wazuka. If you want to play by the rules, right, everyone else is playing by, you can label this as Uji matcha, but really it comes from Wazuka. And now that you know that there's some level of intellectual dishonesty. You know that Uji is an actual town. You know that this isn't actually grown in that town. You're being told you can sell it as Uji matcha, but really it's from this other place. And now that you know, right, are you going to label that as Uji matcha? I'd feel a little dirty doing that now that I know, if you really care about, the product and transparency. But on the other side, you're like, is it fair to yourself and your business when you're in the business of selling tea to play by different rules, right? Especially if you're in a market that might be less educated, right? Maybe Uji matcha really does mean something, right? Being able to put that on your cafe menu means something and means you can charge a higher price when no one has heard of Joyo or Wazuka or Uji Tawara, right? Like, then, why wouldn't you play by the rules of everyone else? And the rules of everyone else who honestly, they don't know. They don't really know where their tea comes from. They're told it's blended by some blend master and they should label it Uji matcha, right? Like it's also kind of fair for them to play by the rules that everyone else is. But at least then they're making a conscious decision in doing that.
Well, it's literally one of the definitions. Like I feel like really there's no right or wrong in here. It's just a different consensus of different groups, and I think the only people with a legitimate reason to get frustrated are the tea farmers that are actually in Uji making tea, and all of the other definitions are just really, I feel like, loosely held by consensus of different people for either commercial reasons or just purely, inheritance of information or culture from their predecessors or from people that they learned tea from. It's very complicated.
Yes and no. I don't know. It depends too what you care about, right? If you care about flavor and sensory and the product experience, and let's take it from the viewpoint of a blind tasting. Knowing the region can give you some level of information. We say that matcha is not very terroir driven because matcha primarily is the flavor profile and quality is a result of human intervention. Shading is a huge homogenizer, especially for how long you shade. It gets this shaded flavor, also known as oika. It boosts umami, it blocks the pathway, preventing sweet and savory amino acids into bitter and astringent catechins, right? And then the fertilizer in the ground is that umami kind of fueling the umami. And then fertilizer has a huge impact. Taste an unfertilized matcha, and you've tasted matcha that tastes nothing like all the other matcha on the market.
Oh yeah.
Really tastes it tastes more different than tea from two different places that have been fertilized typically. But there is a processing culture in these different places. For example, if you do have uji grown tencha that's turned into uji matcha, most of the farmers in Uji are practicing tezumi or hand picking. So there's a huge culture of that. And it tells you that the quality is probably going to be higher. They're willing to spend much more money on fertilizers. Most of the farmers in Uji only do a single harvest. So when you shade a plant, you're essentially suffocating it. So when you shade over the course of multiple times per year, over multiple seasons, it's very hard on the plant. So if you're only shading once a year, like most Uji matcha farmers do, you tend to get even more higher quality from that first harvest. And most of them have very, what we'll call luxury cultivars that are a little more difficult to grow, like Asahi, for example. So saying that it does come from Uji grown tencha, while the terroir might not matter, the human part does matter. Suji-san, Furukawa Seicha, Horishi Shimean, the Shimizu family, Taishi-san, are creating products using these methods that do result in higher quality, right? So if you look at the probability of if you blindly taste uji matcha from uji grown tencha, the probability that it is higher quality when you compare it to the average product coming out of a more industrial place like Wazuka, the probability is that the average Wazuka tea is going to be lower and that the uji one is higher. And it's not necessarily terroir, but it's the processing culture that's happening in those places. So in that
Yeah,
sense,
yeah.
it kind of does matter where, knowing what the origin is.
Well, you are proving that my point, Ryan, right? Like, because I was saying that the Uji tea farmers are probably the only group that will be frustrated by the current status. But all the other definitions doesn't really matter. Like even if you look at processing style, like Yame has a unique processing style, and all the other regions doesn't necessarily have a very unique, well defined style that people can taste and immediately point at. And also like even with the participation of all the other regions. And also for Uji tea farmers, like the chance of a lot of people tasting tea actually being made from Uji is still not that large because a lot of these productions actually goes to all the blend houses. And for all these poetic named cans that you can purchase from different tea brands, they all contain some amounts of Uji grown tencha from here and there. And how do we make sense out of that? Like, do we consider that partially Uji, or like if we really want to be team Uji tea farmers, or do we just totally disregard them as a Uji product, no matter how much percentage of Uji tea they contain?
That is the trickiest one. And actually, the existence of the blend houses is where I get torn the most in this argument. Do you take the most conservative definition or the least conservative definition? Because these blend houses once were making a truly single origin product that was Uji matcha from Uji grown tencha. And actually, they weren't even making Uji matcha. They were making Uji tencha, and the tencha got shipped everywhere and you ground it yourself. It's the product, right? And
Mm.
then it's changed, right? It slowly expanded and expanded. First to towns like Joyo, and then later in the 70s expanded to places like 70s, 80s, and 90s into Wazuka and expanded more into other various places. And, it's a living culture. They were adapting. You had all of these tea ceremony schools across Japan that aided a good supply of Uji matcha from Urasenke and Motosenke. And they expanded, and the chashis did their work in blending, creating these products, creating new products. And you can argue it's all part of a living tradition of Uji matcha. that expanded and expanded, and to the point where actually most of their leaves can come from outside of Kyoto. There's a joke that one of the major blend houses, which will remain nameless, is not headquartered in Uji, but actually headquartered in Mie, because so much of their supply comes from Mie prefecture, not from even Kyoto prefecture. So, the straw
Mm.
that broke the camel's back, and it's a Substack article I'm working on now, is the single estate idea that's imported probably from the West. We don't know who it was, although we think we know who it was, but we don't want to speculate here.
Mm.
Decided to sell single estate tea from Uji for the first time. And the thing that differentiates that tea the most is that it's the real thing from the actual place, right? That's the best way to sell. That's what makes that tea interesting. You taste the perspective of that one farmer in the most historical place for matcha in the entire world, and yet it's the pure and real thing. And then now there's a narrative break because this didn't really exist, the single farmer idea. This level of vertical integration of a farmer selling the tea for themselves, right? It was always these blend houses. Through the early 20th century, from before, all the way up until now. And now you have two fundamentally incompatible narratives because now what do you do with all of this Uji matcha from these blend houses? And then to compound the point, you have other players that are coming into the space, fully utilizing this very broad definition that was established in 2004 by the trademark that everything has to be processed in Kyoto but can come from any of the four prefectures, Narashika, Mie, and Kyoto prefecture. And now we start to see the large Nishio-based companies who set up new factories in Kyoto prefecture to literally now manufacture an origin to create Uji matcha. And the part that's disturbing to me is the way that more Uji matcha gets made is not through innovation. It's not through farmers reclaiming abandoned land or creating a new plot to grow more tea. It's by people utilizing and leveraging this loophole that exists. It's taking tea that would have not been able to be labeled as Uji matcha, which can now be labeled as Uji matcha because we've gone 100 kilometers over the border and set up a factory there. Like, that's the upsetting part. Now, how do you distinguish between the 300 or 200-year-old blend house from these people coming from a different place now utilizing this loophole, essentially? And that's where I get hung up. Because if you only think about Yamamasa Koyama and Maruku Koyama and Ippodo, right, you think very differently than if you think about these newer players that want to come into this land grab, utilizing the rules of the game that exist to create new Uji matcha.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's very difficult because like for all these native big names like Maruku or Yamamasa, they have some standards of doing things. They are aware of the loophole that they essentially actually created the loophole in the beginning. But at least they have some standards of doing something. Although now we know that their standards is losing a little bit as well after visiting some vicinity areas, knowing that they're also suppliers to these big brands.
Yeah, from
They are not
outside.
part of the traditional areas that they claim they are. But at least we can trust. I would say I would trust them more than some of these newcomers. But in nature, they have no difference, right? It's just different levels of pushing the boundary to how much further away. And for hundreds of years, though, I would say that thanks to these blend houses, that matchas still exist to these days. They figured out a way to make the whole system commercially viable, so that this culture can actually survive instead of living in history textbooks. And for so many years of them being a stable income for all these tea farmers, they essentially stolen the narrative of Uji tea or Uji matcha. They are in control of the narrative, and That's why, the current system has so many definitions because there are so many tea houses doing things differently than each other. And the tea farmers have really no sayings of all these because, they have to rely on them as their sole source of income. All these contract being signed, or sometimes even no contract being signed, but all these social engineerings then being enforced into making sure that these tea farmers continue to be their almost serf. Like this is almost a serfdom in a way.
Oh, yeah. This goes back directly to feudal Japan, and that
Yeah,
thing is easy to make.
yeah. And now we finally have one tea farmer that does start to trying to break free from this system. And oh boy, they got so much pushbacks and punishment from all these people. It's a little bit difficult to fathom. But you're absolutely right. Like that now there's a contradicting or a competing definition or a discourse that exist that's fighting back to this legacy definition of what uji matcha is. It's fascinating to look at. It's painful also to look at and to be part of it.
Yeah. I mean, you have the Uji matcha farmers themselves, which have their own set of incentives, and going single origin, single estate, back to what Uji matcha always was, by the way, for most of its history. You could argue that's
Yeah.
the most authentic. But you could also argue that the Marukyus and the Yamamasas and the Kambayashis of the world making these blends are the most living tradition if we think about what was sold as a product. They were the ones that originally owned the customer relationship and the history of blending and of processing, right? Like, and those living cultures are allowed to adapt. They should adapt, otherwise they're dead, right? It's very Japanese philosophy, or especially around Chanoyu, that a a static and sterile tradition is not a tradition at all. It's an artifact. It's something that's in glass. It's something that's dead, and that change is an important part for any living tradition. So those two, camps, I think, have a past. But then you could also argue that these new uji matcha farmers essentially vertically integrating and going direct to consumer or direct to other businesses is a revolution. It's a business model that literally did not exist before, right? It's a change in business model as much as it is anything. And if you don't sell your best material to the blend houses, then the blend houses have even less true uji tencha to make uji matcha, which, there's a finite supply of. And then you have the players coming in that are just capitalizing on all of this change
Mm.
that can literally just set up a new factory in Kyoto. Theoretically, Zongjun, you and I could go set up a new tencha factory. Probably be a lot of red tape, but theoretically we could go set up a new factory or partner with someone to create a new factory and start manufacturing uji matcha by exclusively importing leaves from Mie and processing them and selling it to uji matcha and having it be sold on by other brands as a single origin uji matcha product that has nothing to do with uji, has nothing to do with
Oh
uji.
yeah.
Processing culture has nothing to do with anything.
Oh yeah, we can just talk to the owner of the Caesarea at Uji Murak, and he can help us.
Yeah. And we can import 50% of our tencha from Zhejiang, China, and have it blend in to become an uji matcha blend, which people get confused at, which it's a horrible name, right? Because most uji matcha is a blend. Like a blend of what? Like in today's parlance for the average specialty matcha consumer, it just means that you're mixing cultivars and potentially mixing origins. So uji
Oh
matcha
yeah.
blend is a horribly non-descriptive name.
Even with this new Nihoncha or Japanese tea GI thing, like I read through all the definitions of the policy. And I think technically,
Mm.
even though maybe the tea cannot be called as Nihoncha, it can still be called as Ujicha as long as it's being processed in the right way, regardless of the ingredients coming from elsewhere. It's a little bit ridiculous.
Well, not to mention too, something we forgot to mention on the GI episode is that it doesn't include wako cha or black tea or red tea, depending on how you define that, and awabancha. And I think there's one other one too that I'm forgetting, which is super weird because awabancha is like the most Japanese thing ever. But you can argue, I don't think any other countries are making awabancha. Like, so no culture of copying that tea. Which actually, I really have come to like awabancha. I drink it more and more often. I actually just ran out. I find it really nice digestive tea. But
Good for you. I was just gonna say that I need a dedicated teapot for that tea.
yeah, it has some pretty interesting acidity. You might not want to mix with some of your other teaware.
And aftertaste or after odor.
Let's
Oh,
just say it's complex,
it's
unlike
complex.
any other food. Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead,
acquired
Ryan.
taste. Well, acquired taste, but really good. But okay, if we
Um,
really zoom out, now let's put on another lens of what you care about. And let's put ourselves in the shoes of people who only care about the organoleptic or sensory experience of the product. And another way to put it, let's let the product speak for itself, which is best done in a blind test, right? If you drink it knowing nothing about, and this, by the way, goes into this whole camp of people who are like, let's stop worrying about these labels. Let's just appreciate the tea. Okay, let's just appreciate the tea in this example. I know for a fact that there are some tea in China that we have tasted that no one would think is a Chinese product. They would think it's Japanese quality. We have had Uji matcha from Uji grown tencha that tastes worse than tencha that was milled into matcha in China that we tasted. And that we've had some tea that was higher quality, at least from a blind tasting perspective, what we consider to be good by our own standard and by Japanese standards of what high quality matcha should be from material that wasn't even grown in Japan. Let alone even in Japan, I've had wazuka tea that I thought was better than matcha from Uji grown tencha, either because it was boring or because it had some sort of flaw. So if we only care about the product itself, does this provenance even matter? Does this Uji matcha ness even matter? Right? Theoretically, Uji matcha could be considered a processing culture, and that processing culture could theoretically happen anywhere because there's so much human intervention. So, can a tea grown in Hubei be Uji matcha? Can a tea grown in Mie be Uji matcha, or the spirit of Uji matcha, or Uji matcha style? And I think that's a fair consideration along the question of, does it even matter that we're mislabeling the origin of all of this product?
I think it's well from a purely answering the question point of view. I think it doesn't matter, right? Like the quality is good or similar enough to the point that it doesn't really affect people's ability to distinguish between the product. But I think that in reality, it will be a terrible, almost stupid maneuver to label your product that's being produced elsewhere as UGT. That's that you're essentially just putting yourself into this giant pool of nameless producers, and you are keep fostering this current status quo that's painful for a lot of people, and especially for yourself. Like, because I think a lot of people, regardless of which tea sectors you're coming from, either matcha or oolong or black tea or pu'er, the name of a origin is very important. It's essentially the core value or core aspect of your brand, or sometimes it is your brand of your tea. And the earlier you can establish this consumer recognition of your brand, the better, or the location, the better, the geography, the better. So I think, can you label it as Ujicha? Yes, you can. Should you label it as Ujicha? Absolutely not. If you are actually producing some amazing tea.
Yeah, because you're making a name for wherever you're from. And then you have this diversity of places and new processing cultures, new ways to
Yeah,
differentiate outside of the sea. Because really, I think uchi matcha and the broad definition just lets it, what it's really doing, if you look at the like percentages of the number of the amount of tea that is labeled that way, it's elevating a mediocre product. That's what
I
it's really
absolutely
doing.
agree.
I mean,
Absolutely agree. It's for a very few people that's setting up a ginormously, ridiculously high standard, so that other people can take it on a ride and start selling shitty tea to everybody.
you can also argue it robs the luxury market to the Uji matcha farmer families. Now, that sounds elitist, but let's compare this to wine for a second. If you take a bottle of Romani Conti, or Chateau Lafite Rothschild or any of these really cult classic wines. What wine has done is over many hundreds of years developed a market of people who go deep on the subject, have tons of tasting experience, and are willing to pay more for an elite thing. Now, the wines of this caliber, of which I've only ever had one, that was we both, got to taste through some very good fortune. It's very good. Is it $2,000 a bottle good? No. Like, honestly, on the average day, I'm sure there's some natural wine producers that are doing fantastic work for $50 a bottle, producing wine that I would personally rather drink. But what elevates it to that price is the rarity, the scarcity, and the incredible history and the heritage of making it in those places. When you buy it, you're drinking something that heads of state have enjoyed, that people who has been passed down from generation to generation, the people that get the best French oak barrels, that get the best enologists, that get the best blend masters, all of this perfection of craft that has happened and has been recognized for so long that demands this price. And that's this rich, deep culture that ends up getting supported. And Uji could so totally be that, right? There should be some matcha. Some of the best, and I was just explaining this to someone. I was at a wedding in France recently, and someone was very interested in matcha. And I was saying, for maximum $250, you can get some of the, for a 20-gram can, which, if you take 2 grams a serving, it's $25 a serving. You can literally have the best matcha in the world. Hanzu shaded, hand-picked, Uji native zairai cultivars, slowly processed on a brick oven kiln, hand-sorted, individual leaves with chopsticks for this competition grade tea, ground at 20 to 30 grams per hour on a stone mill. That is crazy. That should be going for so much more money. And having this expansive definition doesn't let this kind of luxury market evolve, which, it sounds very foo-foo or whatever, but it's really where a whole lot of culture lies, right? Like, it's where, like, really the art and the craft and the heritage merge and get preserved and have enough money to get preserved and to reinvest into creating this, what would otherwise be not a very economically viable product.
Well, then Uji matcha will certainly turn into something that you and I will probably not be able to frequently try or try at all, for the sake of, the sheer production of Uji tea being so low.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And I'm not specifically arguing for it. I'm exploring a tension and an opportunity for the market to evolve in a certain way that it already exists in a different industry. That would, by the way, probably be the best outcome for the Uji matcha farming families. That, like, the system already exists. It's just not valued the way that it should be. People aren't actually drinking Uji matcha. And it just
and
so
it
happens that no one knows this, and that all of this tea is just incredibly cheap right now if you actually can find it in the right places.
Yeah, and it would only happen if all these big blend houses just go bankrupt on, next day, and or the government just somehow grant the status, to these tea farmers, so that they can operate on their own. Like the reality is that, seeing how much punishment, that one tea farmer that we were talking about trying to break free from the current system, it's scary for other people. It's terrifying. Like, to be cut off from a system that has been a reliable source of income for so many years, hundreds of years,
Generations.
generations. It's unimaginable probably for a lot of people, and it's not purely a economical decisions, right? Like, Japan is such a societal based culture, that there are a lot of intangible strings that's holding everybody almost like a puppet in day-to-day life, and it's just not really a future that we can expect, probably.
Actually, I have some pushback. Let's say essentially what that world would look like of, allowing the tea industry market, matcha industry market to develop the equivalent of these very rare and sought after wine labels that are highly valued, that are, willing to present a lot of money for a product that is indeed very special, is that it could still coexist. Like essentially, if Uji matcha got GI status and all Uji matcha that had the GI label had to come from Uji grown tencha, there's no reason why the old blend houses who already have relationships with the Uji matcha farmers couldn't produce a GI blend of Uji matcha. The same way that the Yame Gokuro producers, all the Yame people you can buy Gokuro from, they have their Han Yame Gokuro, which is the GI certified one, which has all these different rules around the way it must be grown. That must be, I think it has to be Hanzu Tana, the rice straw shaded with a shelf canopy, so there's no direct coverage. I think it has to be hand picked. There's a bunch of other rules too for the GI. Actually, has to come from Yame. And then they have their quote Yame Gokuro, which, who knows what that actually means. May or may not come from Yame. Certainly processed in a Yame style. And those products just coexist. And the Han Yame, Han
Yeah.
Uji Matcha, Han Uji Matcha, or genuine Uji Matcha.
Well, I think for the tea houses or the blend houses to move into that state, because we almost need to think about Uji tea or Uji cha as a name of a brand for all these tea houses or these blend houses. It's a brand that consumer recognize. It's a brand that they can for sure sell their tea for a higher price, and it's also a brand that they created, arguably.
Totally.
And for them to continue to, operate commercially in a sustainable manner, they either need to create a new term for the true ujicha, maybe we can call it hong ujicha, or they need to give up ujicha and create a new term. There's still a need of consumer recognition for a broad enough definition so that these tea houses can sell the mass market tea for a higher margin so that their business can be sustainable. We're talking about commodity products here. It's there's still a very large group of consumers that doesn't really care about specialty. They just want to drink some delicious tea that has some name that they can, recognize, or they can, give the tea as a gift for other people that other people can recognize. So there's a market need for that demand, and it's just that the current system is, hurting the true Uji tea farmer because like they have been married into this system for so long, and this is right now the only system that works for everybody.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's a lot of the demand for Uji matcha is for people that don't really know the difference. So re-educating the market, especially the domestic market, might be expensive, might have some trust issues. I mean, we've been told multiple times that the average person in Japan believes that Uji matcha comes from Uji. They might know it's a blend of different leaves, and that blend is expected to stay consistent, but I don't think they realize the extent to which it's really the provenance, the true provenance of the actual raw material does not come from that place. But okay, if you zoom out outside of the domestic market and even zoom out further from just these blend houses, and let's say you have this with the perspective of someone in pick a random country trying to create a new matcha brand, which is happening all over the place. In basically every country on earth, there's a bunch of people trying to create their own matcha brand, trying to source this. This creates such a level of confusion in this current system because if you do the math, about 1 in 3 cans of matcha produced in Japan can be called Uji matcha, which is crazy considering that Uji has only 35 farming families. And everyone's applying the specialty framework of a single origin product coming from Uji, but it's not. And now you have a culture and context that is being exploited in Japan by actors that are from other places setting up across the border to get quote unquote the right passport for the tea,
Mm.
labeled as the thing. And then you have a bunch of people unintentionally exploiting the single origin concept or applying a single origin concept that just have no clue how complicated like this whole system is. And no one talks about what they believe Uji matcha to be, right? Because really you need to believe someone's beliefs first before you can understand what they're selling. So the more you know, the more you should distrust everyone's tea labeling. When I'm in Paris, where I live, and I find Uji matcha on the menu, I don't even bother asking any questions, and I don't order it. Like, I know it's not from Uji. I know the person behind the counter has no clue. The brand owner or the owner of the cafe has no clue. The person who sourced the product from the brand owner of matcha probably also has no clue. Right? Just like no one has a clue of where this product is actually coming from. And then you sit back and think to yourself, why can't we just call it by the thing where it's from? It is a blend of tea from these places. And this is the intention behind the blend. We're trying to get it to express this, this, and this for this use case. This is the justification for why this product exists. And instead, we're all focused on just slapping on this meaningless label because people want an authentic experience from the most historical place in Uji, slapping on veil after veil, vanity metric after vanity metric, to create such a fantasy that is so disconnected from reality that's robbing all of these other really interesting stories of the people who actually make the tea. All of these companies, all of this framing, quite frankly, excuse the language, all of this bullshit completely does not take into consideration the people who actually drink the tea and the people who actually make the tea. We're honoring some fantasy that we all want to project onto this product. But if we really truly want to honor the people who make the tea, which come from all over Japan or other countries for that matter, and the people who are actually drinking the tea, and the biggest favor we can give the people actually drinking the tea are facts that cannot be manipulated. We're no longer calling it premium wine, premium matcha. A non manipulated fact is that it's Okumadori cultivar. You don't make that up. That's not a story. It could be very great opportunity for storytelling and for education. And it's storytelling that once you learn, okay, I like Okumadori, it's the same way I like Chardonnay. I might go try something else. But if you say, oh, I like this premium matcha, I want to go find another premium matcha, you didn't learn anything. You're not making the consumer better, discovering what other things that they might actually like. And it's very selfish framing, actually, by all of these matcha companies, by not talking about the region or the processing style or the fertilizing style. Even what type of tencha oven we recently learned has a huge impact. If you have one of these more mass produced tencha ovens, the simple tencha dryers, which are basically air fryers in Kagoshima, it leaves the green leaf almost like spicy green, like a dandelion leaf or arugula, right? It really doesn't have this complexity or sweetness that you get from, radiant heat from a radiant tencha red brick
Well,
oven, right? Like this.
if you buy tea from that specific supplier and you do know these piece of information, do you share that to the consumer?
Well, you could. I mean,
That's
that's
a
like
clear indicator of the lower, quality. Um,
or a great indicator of value. This is a new let me try to sell it to you. The Japanese have invented a new innovation in processing technology for creating matcha that makes it even greener. It better preserves all of the chlorophyll and all of these compounds, giving you a beautiful green cup. It tends to be a little more bitter, a little more harsh, but actually it really balances out the moment that this hits milk. And we know that color is super important, but we also know that creating a balanced taste is super important, which is why we also used Okumadori cultivar, which has naturally much higher chlorophyll content. And when it's shaded, it gets amplified. And when it goes through this type of drying, it gets amplified. And not only that, it's actually much cheaper to make. And we can give you an Argentine Malbec for $10. This is that, but in matcha format. This is how we can afford to give you these fantastic prices. Is it something that you're going to want to consume, as an usacha? Maybe. Give it a month or two. It's going to blow off some of these greener notes, and maybe it's going to result in a more naturally balanced cup. But it's a fantastic product, and we can give it to you for $20. But we
mm,
also source this fantastic tea. It was grown in Uji Tawara. It was put on a traditional tencha oven, radiant brick. It's going to be a little bit less green. It's also using a cultivar that's naturally a little more pale. But this tea is also really great for all of these other reasons. Maybe it was handpicked, maybe it was Tana shelf shaded, maybe it was fertilized, maybe it was a matcha that wasn't fertilized and no pesticides at all. And it has a different framing to use it on. But all of this is not a made up story. It's the truth about the way it was made. And you can spin it to be more or less romantic, right? But there's a time and the place. And what I don't want to see is someone who is trying to sell a $10 bottle of Malbec from Argentina and trying to pass it off as a top Saint-Emilion Bordeaux, right? Which is kind of what's going on by everyone just slapping premium on. It's like literally forcing their consumers to pay an intelligence tax and a markup way larger than they realize. When, if it's on objective facts, there's none of this manipulation that can be done.
I totally agree. Totally agree. It's just incredible difficult to change, right? Like there are a couple layers that I think we're facing right here. First is the accessibility of information. Like for a lot of these tea farmers, they just wouldn't tell you exactly what's going on, and you really have to pull the information from them as a brand owner or a product creator. And for so few of them that do end up sharing the information, it's one or two data points that people can use, but it's not enough to build up a large enough map or a system for consumers to really learn about the differences. At least not for now for a lot of regions. I would love to see that happen in the future. And second, there isn't again a regulatory entity, someone or some entity that police all these people, hold people accountable for their claims. It's just almost impossible to exist. And like for a consumer, you really have to learn or pay all these tuitions by yourself to get to some experience level to be able to make a judgment by yourself. But there's no other ways to hold people accountable. And for now, there's two competing narratives, right? There's all these either misinformed or ill-informed brand owners or lazy brand owners or purely dishonest brand owners who's taking a ride of this whole Uji tea bandwagon to trying to sell tea for a higher margin, inferior tea for a higher margin. And there is this specialty tea market or this tea brands that you're advocating for, Ryan, that's trying to tell a more complicated, more honest story about all these teas. But one party cannot shut the other party's mouth. Like there's no way you can just go there and sue them or like tell them to like stop doing what they're doing. Like the specialty people cannot tell the commodity people what to do, and the commodity people cannot tell the specialty people what to do. The only way out is that you spread enough awareness, you win the competition of discourse. That consumer by the end of the day will vote with their own money, and then one will eventually convert to the other. That's the only way out.
Yeah, the court of
Uh,
public opinion. I mean, that's the real war that should be fought, right? It's
yeah,
winning
yeah,
hearts
yeah.
and minds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it takes all of us, the whole community, to do so. We shared our opinion and our view of what Uji tea or matcha should be, but we cannot hold anyone accountable. We There's no one can do that. We have to win the hearts of the consumers to win this battle.
Well, also, just as a quick land acknowledgement too, is that we're not from Uji. We are not Japanese. We are not at least active Chanayu practitioners. We are people trying to build a business in the context of this industry and also try to build awareness for a lot of these topics through this podcast. But, we have a very different level of skin in the game than other people do. And, in a lot of ways, you can ask yourself, is this our battle to fight? And I don't know. I feel very conflicted about that. We are not Uji matcha farmers. Our family livelihood does not depend on this. Quite frankly, our business does not depend on whether or not people are honest about labeling, where their tea comes from and how it gets called and the
Yeah,
complications of it.
I mean, if you are a
But as a consumer, I deeply care.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you are a small business owner and like the only way for you to be able to sell your tea is to label your tea as uchi matcha, like please do. Like don't kill your business. Don't like go bankrupt because of that. You can wait until the market is mature enough, the specialty market is mature enough in the future, and then it's your decision to convert to that party or not. But if you are a large enough tea company, you have a healthy cash flow, and you do have the capability of, playing the game. We really hope that there will be more of you to do that, to inform the market, to educate the market, to move the market into a more just a more interesting direction for everybody.
Yeah, just a much more interesting direction than, all of this tea getting dumped into one label that ignores all of the farmers who are actually doing the real work of bringing this product to market.
Yeah.
Some of them want to be recognized, others don't want to be recognized specifically, but unless people are pulling this out of these places, there's no reason for them to change or modify the status quo.
Mm.
Japanese farmers are aging, they have no succession plans. Taking on the risk of doing this is just so not worth it unless we make it worth it. Like it's very much a revolution because it's really setting up a new business model, having the Uji matcha farming families, sell less to wholesale, less blended products, more sell their own products that are actually from Uji grown tencha. And then all the Uji matcha supply regions also doing the same. And we see more and more of that. Even at the Kombini and the Lawson in Wazuka, there's a whole little like table full of Wazuka tea. They're really leaning into that hard, and the local products that are actually from that place.
Yeah.
So, we are starting to see this change, but still so much tea just gets blended. And I think the first step is awareness. Like if you're going to label your tea as a matcha brand, as a single origin product, at least know whether and what the provenance of the tea actually is and what you're calling it. And that's the game that you're playing, right?
Mm,
And
mm, mm.
it's then you make your own judgment call. I'd love to see the world in the next 5 years shift from everyone not knowing to at least everyone knowing what they're doing. And then I think this is going to be one person by person, farmer by farmer, finding these farmers say, we'd love to highlight you, or we'd love to highlight this as a single origin product instead of just calling it this thing. And then you build, these different identities for this product. Build up the fame of these different regions, discover what's special, tell the thousand human stories that are all covered up by the two syllables on a label, which is Uji, which is selling, romance, fantasy of a place, the fantasy of an idea.
We can start selling new romance, and they don't necessarily need to be a fantasy. And all the places and people scattering around the world making wonderful products, they all have their own unique story to tell, and it should be the new romance. And these romance on this time have some ground truths that people can verify and trust.
I just thought of something. Uji has like a 400-year head start in creating its brand, in creating a name, and building consensus that it's the good thing. And it was the only place in the world where matcha was being made for hundreds of years because it was a state controlled monopoly. And, that processing culture and the culture of making it stayed concentrated. And it hasn't been in the last 2 decades. But these other regions are new matcha growing regions. Nishio and the areas around Aichi, have been doing it for maybe 120 years, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 140 years, but it's still pretty new in the grand history of matcha. Same thing, Wazuka is super new. Joyo is a little bit older. I think the oldest places in Joyo date back to the late 1800s, but they just haven't had time or the opportunity to build up their name. Just, I think, as an artifact is Japanese society and the way these products were positioned and sold, the top downness of the way, Japanese culture operates. And they just haven't been given an opportunity to shine a stage, to break free of that mold. And maybe it's just there
Mm,
hasn't
mm.
been enough time yet.
matcha is so old, but at the same time so new for everybody.
Yeah, and when you compare it to places like China across, like, the really large different categorical differences among the different tea, like, you have, Phoenix Mountain Dansong, you have Wuyi Yancha from Fujian, you have Pu'er from Yunnan, you have Baicha white tea from Fuding, right? All of these places have really long, deep processing histories when we think about tea and tea origin. And the reality is for matcha, there's only one old tea origin, and it's Uji. And then everything else is less than 200 years old. Yame, Kagoshima, Aichi, or even the matcha being grown in Korea or China. It takes time for myths to develop and for consumer awareness to take place. But it can happen, and I hope it happens within this century, and it finally has the opportunity to happen because, matcha has gone through its 3rd wave of consumers. The first were, the daimyo, the shogun, the elites of feudalistic Japan, and then it switched to the tea ceremony practitioners, that were all happening in Meiji, post-Meiji. And now matcha's gone from a really like obscure Japanese ceremonial ingredient to something that you find in every coffee shop and in all these places around the world being represented in such diverse and new markets. It's just a matter of time. It's almost an inevitability as people go searching for more and more tea, meet more and more people. Even this last year, the difference between the harvest in 2025 and 2026, just looking at it through Instagram, is so different. It used to be so rare to see the inside of a tencha factory on social media. Now it's feel like it's everybody. Feels like every day someone posts a new picture with Suji-san. It's like it's happening before our eyes. And these people, these brand founders, these markets care about very different things. And idea of knowing where your food comes from is coming. And even if you talked to us 2 years ago, we had no idea that most Uji matcha didn't come from Uji.
Mm.
This is a very new realization even for us. And it just maybe just takes time for this to spread and for people to realize and apply their own values. Maybe we're being a little too harsh because like the distribution of information is still like it hasn't happened yet.
And the quality from other regions too. Like within Japan, the quality from different region has been rising. Even Kagoshima are making some pretty interesting tea. And outside of Japan, Korea, China, the quality of Chinese matcha, has really significantly increased. Also, right in front of us, like compared to a few years ago. And now we just saw the India being part of the player
Yeah.
as they're making their first auction level competition tea within their own country. It's fascinating to see this culture blossoming everywhere, and we do
Sam,
hope we do think that this is future hope that's hopeful enough for us to see it unfold.
Sam, I want to go philosophical a moment. Like, what is the truth, right? Is truth what the Japanese trademark says is uji matcha? Is the truth about where the tea was grown? Is the truth what consumers believe in their own mind, right? If every American wakes up tomorrow and says, I am not an American, is it still America? Is America
Well,
not just one big collective belief in a
well,
place? And
well, I think there's a tautology here, right? Like it's the truth in this sense is a abstract definition as well, and we are trying to explained a abstract definition using another abstract definition or explanation, which is the definition of a tautology. There's actually no truth here. If we want something that's solid, there's a camellia sinensis. But
well, I mean, you could also argue, and I agree it's a tautology, but it depends on what lens, what abstract concept you are applying to another abstract concept. So let me take the abstract concept of perception. If perception is reality, and most people in the world believe that uji matcha is a particular thing, right now we've gone from awareness of people who even know what uji matcha is
but but
to,
but
let's say,
is
the population. Japan and a few extreme tea freaks and geeks like us abroad to now being hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of people. The perception by the raw numbers of what Uji matcha is in
But
people's minds being written by the brand owners in each of these countries, which means we have an opportunity as a global specialty matcha society of people spreading this culture to set the narrative, which becomes the reality in most of the people's heads who are selling Uji matcha and
yeah,
consuming, quote,
but even from a perception point of view, like I don't think I have a definition for uji matcha. Like the sheer difference between different matcha that's produced from uji is so large. It's enormous, even from a taste perspective. Like we even had bad tasting uji tea that's actually from uji, and I think it's too difficult to define this product in a way that everybody can understand geography, the physical location of these tea being grown. But for that to be verified, you have to, see through the entire process. You have to pick tea with the farmers and see processed in the tencha factory, and then see that being shiage separately from with all these other teas being shiaged at the same factory from other regions, and then it gets repackaged separately, and then that's your UGT. I feel like unless you really see through this entire process, there's very little, I would say, trust that can be formed, or verifiable experience being formed for everybody to acknowledge, unless it's really from a trustworthy source that you have personal relationships with.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, even the chashis, right, like get objective truth about the lots of tea that they're buying, either direct from the farmers or even at auction. I mean, these are batched separately. And like, even if you go down one level in the industry, further down the supply chain, or further up the supply chain, depending on the direction, they do know what they're working with. They know the cultivar, they know all the information about it and get to taste it. So it's just like if you pluck the tea out of the system when it's being sold at auction or being commissioned or contracts in place from these blend houses to the farmers, right? Then you get to the source and could sell it as a specialty product with verified provenance and all these details. But the
Yeah,
point is, like, it can't be made up, right? When you have all of these objective truths, we're not talking about an abstract concept to describe another abstract concept, right? Like saying Uji matcha is from Uji grown tencha is just a objective fact. We don't have to get into the spirit of blending and the culture of these blend houses or the legal definition, right? You can have the legal abstract concept to describe this abstract word. You can have the cultural abstract concept to describe this abstract word. You could have, like, it's all these abstractions, as you're saying. And even the abstraction of consumer perception, what people believe, the folksonomy of a word, the way it's, you know, a thing that lives inside the minds of everyday consumers, you could argue is the truest reality because that's what everyone believes in, right? Like but you can't fight like this yabukita cultivar. There's no stories involved there, right?
there's some stories involving yabukita. It's fascinating, actually. But I guess my argument is that even with Uji cha, Uji tea being grown in Uji, it's still like so different from each other. There's so many different teas being grown in Uji that there's not a unique or definable Uji-ness that people can point their fingers at. And not to mention, for the current system, you are getting a lot of other teas being blended or being mixed into the uji cha that's sitting in front of you. And for those people who bothered or had the capability to go so far to verify their tea actually being produced in uji, there's still a lot of difference between all these teas. And it takes a lot of time for anyone to get informed enough to be able to taste the uji-ness, if that actually exists
That's an
from
interesting
uji.
point. Because we do know that there is like direct cover machine harvested yabukita in Uji. And that sits next to plots that are from like luxury cultivars that are handpicked and go through like crazy fertilizer regimens. There's some
Mm,
even in the
mm.
same photo, in the same plot of mountain, where you see these two things next to each other, even in
Yeah,
Uji,
very
giving
obvious different shitate.
very different like trimming of the bush.
Mhm.
You can immediately tell the way it's intended to be picked by just looking at it. So you're right, but also if you take the average product of Uji is still elevated because it is where people are carrying on these traditions of higher labor methods, of these endangered methods that are really just not that economically viable unless you are able to sell your tea for a higher price because there's a market that's willing to pay for it and a way that it wouldn't be if you're producing it in a new area that has less cachet. So, like, I mean, yes and no. If you look at the average quality tea from Mazuka versus from Uji, Uji will be on average higher quality because they use more expensive, more laborious techniques that ends up produced. But their incentive models are different too. Maybe they're trying to win competitions. We've also recently learned that a lot of the Uji matcha farming families do not rely on tea as their sole source of income. So,
Yeah, yeah,
if you're
that's true.
trying to win competitions or you're doing a very extreme philosophy of fertilizer or protecting endangered processing methods, right? Like you have very different incentive loops than you are if you're a new farmer in Wazuka that's trying to make a name for yourself that actually has to sell tea to make money.
Mm, mm.
But there's a huge piece of me. Let's just call it for what it is. But you're right. It's all these tautologies of abstract concepts defining another abstract concept. And you have legal abstract concepts. You have cultural abstract concepts. You have like consumer reality abstract concepts. They're
Okay, Ryan.
all
Here,
historical.
here's another thought experiment. So I think we can both agree on one verifiable truth is the geography, right? The physical location that exists as a reality in this world. That's uh, that's touchable and doesn't move. What if someone, for some future policy change or figure out some guanxi to maneuver from a different country that start acquiring tea plots in Uji and start using their own interpretation and methods to produce tea with even non-Uji cultivar, but it's actually tencha made in Uji. Like, do we call that Uji cha?
Yeah, well, great question. Well, what do you care about? It comes back to that. Do you care about the culture? Do you care about the consumer experience? Do you care about the legacy and history? And you get a very different answer depending on what lens you apply.
Yeah, I
Let's
mean, like it really could be a future. Like all these tea farmers are getting really old in Uji, and thanks to Taishi-san, who's making a lot of effort in making tea and also kits at the same time. There will be like very little people to take over in the future. That's like actually from Uji, and there will
Oh,
be
you have
influx of people.
Jinjiro.
Yeah,
Fuji-san has a
Jinjiro-san.
son. Yeah. There are some
But
younger Uji matcha farmers.
there will be influx of people coming from other regions within Japan and maybe in the future outside of Japan to Uji to start farming, and that could very possible be a future.
Oh, yeah, very possible.
Mm,
It's especially with all of these abandoned plots. I think the regulations make it very difficult, but theoretically not impossible. Which,
And it
yeah,
could be
then
like and could be totally delicious too. Like think about Baisa Nakamura, like our friend studied tea in Kagoshima, and now he's making tea in Uji, and some of his tea are really really tasty. It just doesn't taste quite like what traditional Uji tea tastes like, but they're fantastic.
yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't know. That's such a good point. And then
Mm,
how does it live and evolve, and what do we consider what's real, and how does that reflect our own values? And I don't know. That it would spiritually be less Uji matcha than it would be if it was from multi-generational family using Uji native zairai. And that's another interesting point too, is there's a Uji-ness even within Uji, right? If you're using a cultivar like yabukita, that comes from Shizuoka zairai,
yeah.
which, was adapted from some form of natural selection with human intervention over, hundreds of years within Shizuoka to yield a very specific cultivar that's now being moved to Uji. That's less Uji than something that comes from the hundreds of years of Uji native zairai, like Uji Hikari or Samidori or Asahi. Narino, Okunoyama, all Uji native zairai. So then then is yabukita from that's grown in Uji really Uji matcha? If you put on the historical lens and the genetic lens, I'd say it's less Uji matcha. There's a Uji matcha-ness, and that scale looks so different depending on what value system you project on top of it.
Yeah, yeah,
A
yeah.
fascinating topic.
It is. It is.
I
I
mean,
don't think I have
really,
any answer to this.
to believe in Uji matcha, you have to hold contradictions in your mind.
Mm.
No matter what position you're taking, you are dismissing another very valid narrative. And that's just the reality. And you just have to accept that believing in Uji matcha by any definition is to hold a contradiction in your mind.
Okay, my vote goes to the most tasty and the cheapest matcha on the table.
Ah.
And the Chinese matcha, great. I'm taking it.
So, yeah, I only like Uji grade matcha from Zhejiang.
Uji, great. Wow, that's new.
No, 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 but I thought that was very clever from one of the Chinese matcha I
That's
mean,
true.
it is
That's
kind
true.
of
A
a
lot of
quality
them are talking
standard.
about a lot of them are talking about their being supplier to Uji tea companies.
Yep.
That's uh, that's hilarious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality of Uji matcha is that the definition has changed. The genetics have changed. I mean, even the tea that's today, and I'm writing a big Substack post about it that I'm going to release, and I'd like to record an episode on it if we haven't beat this Uji tea, Uji matcha horse to death. Is the move from zairai to cultivars is huge. Right, the
Mm,
tea
mm.
that was being consumed for hundreds of years that was Uji matcha completely died 50 years ago when
Yeah.
everyone switched to cultivars. It is just such a different, like such a massive difference in the secondary and tertiary implications about the way tea gets blended, the way taste gets homogenized, less genetic diversity, the fact that there doesn't, it no longer has a taproot, like biologically, physiologically, huge plant differences, which are definitely going to result in differences in taste, the way fertilizer gets applied and absorbed, the way they get valued. You'd have to value each individual zairai batch or zairai plot, versus having Samidori rates and Okumidori rates. And yes, there's going to be variation within those, but there's huge differences in the way those products get traded. And like
Mm,
that's
mm.
probably only scratching the surface. And
And
not to mention the fact every leaf of Uji tea hits a conveyor belt. To my knowledge, there's not anyone doing truly hand processed tea the way that you see in the old pictures when you look at the way Uji matcha used to be produced back in the day before mechanization. So it's just gone
yeah,
through so many different changes.
and as Chinese tea drinkers, the idea of older trees, older arbor, being valued so differently back in the days versus now is also fascinating. Like people actually do value older trees in Japan back in the days, but now it's all about young trees, robustness, vibrant taste, vibrant color, and then tree dies.
Yeah, it's it that I really look forward to publishing that article, which kind of deep
Mm,
dives
mm.
into that. And I feel like it's only scratching the surface. I think the next year project is I want to really do a comprehensive piece on the move from zairai to cultivars. I feel very passionate about that as someone who deeply cares about more natural ways of agriculture and tea farming. As someone that believes that older trees are generally higher quality, especially for Japanese tea. Honestly, if you taste 100-year-old like sencha, 100-year-old trees, and they make sencha from it, and it comes from zairai, so it has a tap root. Can take boiling water. Tastes good. Like it really makes all of these other Japanese teas taste really weird. Like it can't take
Mm.
boiling water. They taste almost unnaturally umami. And when you go back to this more natural way of farming that was highly prized as little as 70 years ago, using old trees, it is just so much more interesting and complex. Like what happened? And why
I
did
feel like
everyone's quality change?
I feel like we really should talk to some researchers or historians in all these tea institutes in Japan to get more information from it. And I would love to see some gushus in Japan. Still haven't seen any older trees in Japan, which is crazy.
Yeah, we need to do that. Well, there's the Okunoyama mother plant. I don't know if we'll ever be allowed by Hori-san to go visit it. I'd be incredibly grateful just to see it.
Yeah,
Although
yeah.
I'd also understand if they want to keep it a bit of a secret which one it is, because it's sort of a national living treasure in the same way that some of the older mother trees of in China are highly, highly, highly protected. Some of them have constant surveillance, like the old Dahongpao trees. Like you can't get anywhere near those. You can see
Yeah,
them, but you could never go walk up and touch one.
but all these 100-year-old trees in Fenghuang, in Wuyishan, in Yunnan, you can go see them and touch them, and they're fascinating to see, to visit.
Yeah, and some of the other regions. That's true.
You know, it's yeah, I would love to see that in Japan. Right now, I've only seen all these very short little garden bushes,
Yeah.
which is a little sad.
Yeah. I mean, the reality of most tea trees, if you think about the trees as a living being, most of the tea trees that make matcha in Japan are literally worked to death, put in incredibly unnatural environments with extremely high levels of pesticides, fertilizer, and being shaded for very long periods of time, which would never naturally happen to that degree in nature, pushed to the
Mm.
very brink. That's just the reality of the life of those living beings. Not that I'm a supernaturalist, but what Uji matcha families discovered with the cultivation, 400 years ago or around 400 years ago, the exact date is unknown, really is a pretty extreme and interesting way of agriculture. And what's even more a historical peculiarity or curiosity was the fact that it was a state controlled monopoly for hundreds of years. And what is the most disturbing part to me, deeply caring about genetic diversity, is that all the Uji native zairai, and we've talked to a lot of these Uji matcha farming families, and they started to switch to cultivars around the 60s and 70s. I'm sure some of it was captured at the institutes, the genetic diversity, but there's no way that all of it was captured. And you had hundreds of years of an unknown experiment of natural selection. If you have seed propagated tea, every plant is a little bit different in the same way that siblings are a little bit different. And the trees that were not able to take shaded cultivation died. The trees that were not able to take the weather and the climate died. The teas that were not able to survive high levels of fertilization, which they were doing back then, even back then, from night soil, mostly from human feces, they died. So you have all of this sort of Darwinian or semi Darwinian process happening over hundreds of years, and all of this genetic legacy was ripped up. Some of it was saved at the research centers, certainly not all of it. And now it's very sad. You see cultivars from Uji native zairai, like Asahi, can no longer take the heat and the changing climate within Uji, and how a lot of Asahi plants are not doing well when you go to visit actual Uji matcha farming families. And who knows what genetics, what traits, what genotypes and phenotypes existed among that native heirloom seed stock that are gone. And you cannot just replace it. And I find that a great shame in the modernization. At the same time, I totally understand why everyone switched from zairai to cultivars. It's a huge difference. And Uji is really a living culture. And if you put on like genetic history of Uji, I mean, unless you're having Uji native zairai cultivars, are you really drinking Uji matcha the way it was understood to be drank for all these years? Is another thing, worth asking. There's just so many different lenses you can put on this topic. And like we talk so much about Uji, but Uji really is where it stops and starts because that's where all this came from. And and the only place that did it for hundreds of years. And it's really quite a beautiful thing that it still survives to this day. And when you apply those lenses on it, I do find myself getting offended how much mediocre tea and non Uji grown tencha matcha can be labeled and take on this legacy that is still changing to this day. It's such a complicated, it's an interesting story, full of drama too.
Yeah, yeah. Love to see more of these drama happening in the future. It's really part of the culture too. And if you, the more you understand, at least for me, the more I appreciate the tea more that's lying on my cup.
Yeah. Whether or not it even comes from Uji. Like I really appreciate my tea coming from other places too. It's and all the work that has to get in to make this product. Like Those are the real things we should be celebrating, not the fact that
Yeah.
you have 100% Mie leaves slapped Uji matcha in because it was done doing Uji style processing somewhere in Kyoto Prefecture, we don't know where, that has lost its provenance along the way. It's told some BS story that was slapped on the label, right? Like the really true interesting stories of this human effort, the history, the legacy of what actually reflects the work of the people who got that tea into your cup.
Yep. It really is a symphony of two species. It's a biological story of a tea plant, but also an anthropological story of all these people getting involved into making this product.
Totally. And them co-involving together over hundreds of years in Uji, which is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
very
yeah.
special culture which should be celebrated. But yep, there's no one right answer. And this debate episode, I think we did the best job we could exploring the tension that exists here and giving,
Mm,
really in good faith trying to map out the different arguments that people are making for or against these different
yeah.
definitions.
Well, if you have any arguments or opinions, please share to us too. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, what are we missing in the story? Please reach out if you feel strongly disagree or can identify knowledge gaps even in our own thinking. We'd
Mm,
love to follow up on that to explore this topic even further.
yeah.
So this concludes the end of the this Uji Matcha series, the Uji no Matcha piece that we have released. We have some extension series, including on quote what happened to all of Uji's old tea trees and a couple others that are going to be released on our Substack. We may or may not do a podcast episode about it, depending on how tired we are of saying the word Uji. And then I promise we will move on from this topic and find some very interesting things to think about and talk about as well. And we're going to have a lot more interview episodes coming up with some very fresh and interesting and unique perspectives, some from some wonderful friends and people we've met in the tea industry over the years.
Awesome.
Awesome. So thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, please consider sharing with a friend, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.
See you in the future.